requirements for documentation, like an environmental impact assessment or a cost-benefit analysis. And then in the third step, there are criteria for how to make the decision. And if you take the Swedish Environmental Code, you need to weigh between costs and benefits, for instance, in order to maximize expected utility. So that's one example. Another criteria could be to try to decrease the probability for the worst case, which is called the max-mean criteria. So there are different criteria. And in all these cases, it's important to focus on who are involved in these committees. What kind of documentation is required? Do you need to prove, for instance, in a cost-benefit analysis that the proposals discounted to net present value compared to investment costs? Please, Isa, can you mute your microphone? We hear your laptop. Which might be challenging if we have lack of knowledge, for instance, or if we have non-identification of co-benefits, which I've done studies on. And then the final issue is then how do you weigh between these different types of input material? And there are hurdles in all these cases, which I've seen the last 25 years being an independent expert in a number of governmental committees in Sweden and in a number of high-level groups at the European Commission. Maybe that's a bit too comprehensive, but yeah. Do you have a follow-up on that, Jonathan?
I'll leave the floor to others for now. To hear
Okay.
from other people.
So the floor is open for comments. Kevin. It's a bit difficult to hear you.
Sorry. Is that better?
Much better.
Sorry. You made the comment that we know what to do, and I suppose my concern about not just about net zero, but actually about the last at least 20 years, arguably longer, is that we have deliberately underplayed the challenge, and so we've never had to stop and think, what do we need to do? And because every year we've done that, the following year the challenge is bigger, but we're still holding to the previous years. You know, we won't even admit to that level of failure. And so I don't think we really do know what the policy landscape looks like to deliver, because we haven't yet had to address that. I think it's so fundamentally different from our fear. It's so fundamentally different from anything that we've even thought about so far, that we're just scratching on the surface of what that new landscape might look like. And that's my fear with net zero. It's the latest way to reconcile what is so blatantly, obviously irreconcilable now. So I'm not convinced that we've really even put a toe into the landscape or into the water of a new zero carbon future.
Thank you. I think we disagree quite strongly on the leverage you can get or not in relation to net zero. But I agree with you indeed that we've just dipped our toes in terms of change. When I say that we know what we need to do, I can just make it a bit easy for myself now and say that we know much more about what we need to do than we're doing at present. We know that we should consume much less red meat, that we should go improve infrastructure for walking and bicycling instead of private car commuting patterns, etc., etc., etc. We know that we should improve energy savings, energy efficiency. We know why we're not doing it. We know which tools and policies we could put in place. So we know in the number of cases how we can really leapfrog. That will not take us all the way. And we need to do some fundamental transformative changes that are difficult to comprehend now, but we're not even picking the low-hanging fruits. That's what I mean. And we know how we could do that. As you know it, I know it, most of those being here know, all of us, what we could do in addition to what we're doing now. And my question is, why are we not doing it then? Why are you not doing it, Kevin? Why am I not doing it? And all the rest of us. That's most interesting for me. but I'm not saying that we have the full map or all road maps or the entire idea, but saying that we need to change value. I noticed some words you mentioned, Kevin. We need to change our view in equity, value, time, etc. I mean, that's not easy. We need to do that, but we also need to pick the low-hanging fruits, and we need to do all those things at the same time. And what I can see among policymakers and policy systems, in laws, in economic policies, etc., I see a lot of barriers, gaps, hurdles, burn-off proof requirements, etc., that we can change, that will help us move along the way. And I think this rhetoric that is associated with climate policy, like burden sharing, in Swedish you can make the argument we shouldn't focus on bördefördelning but skördefördelning. So instead of burden sharing, it's about benefit sharing, because most policies are profitable in the near future, which is also, if you identify that allows you to avoid the challenges associated with wicked problem natures, where you see the benefits of successful action being non-problems in the future. Well, yes, that's comment. Mats and Anna, I let you both in one by one.
Thank you.
Mats first.
I'm a local politician in the Swedish region, and it's interesting to talk about the hurdles and the obstacles for making change, because it's very easy to get all the political parties behind the general goals, like reducing the CO2 emissions and stuff like that. But when it comes to action, it's much more difficult, because every time you try to change something that is going on, people are defending the situation as it is, like subsidizing local airports and stuff like that, because then always a debate about local employments arrives. Or we have to fire 50 persons working at this workplace or stuff like that. And it seems like the whole debate, even on national level and local level, is very much about afraid for changing things. And I don't have any really good solutions except but talk about all the new jobs that are arising, like in Gällivare and Boden and stuff like that. That's very important to point on that use, but it's difficult to have all these examples in local places, but we need to struggle on, and it's very difficult to change the behavior and the fear of getting behind, I'm afraid.
Thank you. So I will comment in a while. Anna?
My comment is on the same line, since I'm a behavioral psychologist. So I think we need to focus more and learn more about the psychological risks of decision making, because the climate crisis is a situation without a very clear road. We don't exactly know, nobody knows where we will end. And to lead in a situation with that amount of uncertainty poses a lot of challenges on decision makers, on politicians. The personal risk of making an error might be very high concerning their political life or other very personal risks for the decision makers. And if we don't sort of understand more and can create some kind of a supportive system for politicians, I think it's very hard to really advance forward in a very rapid pace. So this is my bit of the puzzle to add to this discussion.
Thank you. If I may just give a comment that perhaps links to both of these, I would say that climate science, civil society, environmentally aware politicians and others in companies and so on have since, well, I started to know about climate change at gymnasium school in 1986, a few years before the first IPCC report, thanks to one of the teachers when I took a course in environmental knowledge, as it was called. But I would say that in the decades since then, climate science has proven that we sort of the case for taking actions. We know that we need to take actions because otherwise we will end up in huge problems, costly, troublesome, etc., etc. And the last couple of decades, and when I started professionally working with these issues, I was confronted with the typical answer: yes, okay, we know, but think about growth, think about employment, think about people in rural areas, think about the elderly, think about children, think about everybody, and think about no one. I mean, those counter arguments. But what we have seen in the last 20 years is a development in which the arguments against have been eroded one by one. So, Mats, in terms of the local unemployment issue, we can clearly see that you can boost employment by taking measures to combat climate change. So that argument is not so valid any longer, even though it's common, it's not so strong and valid any longer, when even the Confederation of Swedish Enterprises and the trade union, LO, is saying that we can generate growth and jobs by taking climate measures. That's a scapegoat for some, an excuse for some, but for some this is a real understanding. And when I was an expert in Miljömålsberedning, the All Party Committee on Environmental Objectives, we could clearly see that all the calculations on loss of GDP were really dependent on the variables you considered, etc., etc. And over the course of a century, it was ridiculous to use that as an argument against, which made those political parties concerned about growth losing their counter arguments. And eventually they actually agreed on the policy proposal on the Climate Change Act and so on. And I think those types, in relation to what you said, Anna, those types of arguments, including visualizing, identifying the co-benefits that often follow, are important support for local, regional, and national decision makers, showing that the cry wolf surrounding climate policy is actually false. This is something good and beneficial for society, even in the short run, from a health point of view, etc., etc. That's strengthening the willingness to go forward in decision making. And what I really is becoming frustrated about is when the debate about what you can do in the nitty-gritty details of today to move ahead step by step, or leapfrogging and transforming, it is confronted with, we can't do that without changing values, ideas, the view and equity, time, etc. We need to do all these things in parallel, otherwise we will never be able to avoid the worst outcome we can think here. So that was a comment as well to René's comment in the chat. So we have time for additional questions, I think. We'll see when they will throw us out.
Yeah, we have actually, Mikael, I think we have another 5 minutes or so before the break. And I'm sorry, I wasn't present to introduce this session before, but my computer broke.
That's okay. So Ola, Rickard, and Nina, 1 minute each to state your comment or question.
Thank you. I'm Ola Gabrielsson. I'm also a local politician, one of the local foot soldiers, I suppose. My problem, or rather my interpretation of the Swedish peculiarity, is that we trust our politicians so much so that we give up all our decision possibilities to them. So we trust them to sort this out for us, and that means that we don't have to do anything. the problem for politicians is that we don't have any possibilities to change anything except for the local policies. I'm talking about politicians on a local level. How the problem is that in Sweden, and in my particular case in Stockholm, the consumption part, I mean, what's left after the territorial emissions is the larger part. So, and politicians don't have any chance to change anything of that. How do we, as politicians, make our citizens understand that they need to accept regulations also on their private consumption?
Thank you. I will let Richard and Nina give a couple of comments as well.
Yeah, so I can go. Richard Bloom, I'm representing the Natural Step International. My question is, or observation is really about the link between the whole climate question and then other dimensions of sustainability. And I'll just give an example. So here I'm thinking about the fossil industry. Everyone knows that we need to get off fossil fuels. But then if you look at other uses of fossil hydrocarbons, like the chemical industry, you see these projections where the chemical industry is currently using 5 to 8% of all fossil hydrocarbons, but it's predicted to double as an industry by 2030. And then it's also predicted to move from 5 to 8% of fossil hydrocarbons to 50% of global hydrocarbons being used in the chemical industry. At the same time as that industry is also talking about carbon neutrality. So I have a question more about how, I mean, you know, people are sort of proceeding like, yeah, we'll work on our carbon emissions and then we'll somehow still work with these fossil hydrocarbons. And I just wonder if there's any sort of consensus out there on whether there is a future of future use for fossil hydrocarbons, or whether you see that we're totally off all sorts of fossil hydrocarbons and everything needs to shift into bio-based. I think there's a lot of confusion around how these things interconnect.
Thank you. And Nina, I want you to comment as well.
I think we might need to learn to think on different levels, but for example, both focus on how people can have better lives and reduce greenhouse gases at the same time. Now carbon emissions are very tight connected to progress and welfare, both in practical aspects and in people's minds. And I think we often talk about act local and global at the same time. We need real hope for the future, and I think we need to strengthen the grassroots movement. There should be an interplay somewhere between the political versus some kind of opinions, common people, because the politicians don't dare to act otherwise. And my question is, how do we learn to think on different levels?
Thank you. Well, two of you raised the question here of how to sort of bring citizens on board and convince them. And a lot of people are concerned. A lot of people are joining the marches, Fridays for Future, etc., before the pandemic, and support that. And I was so glad to see, was it 60,000 persons in Stockholm in the manifestation for taking action to combat climate change, and there were like at the most 60 persons in the car in the manifestation for the right of car owners, arranged by a few parliamentarians. So I mean, a decade back it would be the other way around often, but my experiences are at least that it is important to show that it is doable, to show solutions in the near future, in the near in time and space for people, to show that there are options that are better from a number of different perspectives, and that's why I focus on studying these co-benefits. The reason why I started was that when I was in this all-party committee on environmental objectives and the climate policy framework was prepared, some politicians asked all the time, what does it cost? What does it cost? What does it cost? And that resulted in, and it was even a requirement for this type of inquiry, to conduct cost-benefit analysis. Well, we could show by help of researchers and consultants that the outcome of that type of exercise varies a lot depending on how you calculate, and it's a bit ridiculous to try to do that in the longer time perspective. But interestingly, if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we also reduce air pollutant levels, and those by that time costed 46 billion Swedish crowns annually. But the benefit of reducing those levels to half, let's say, weren't considered on the benefit side of the coin in the cost-benefit analysis, which made a politician consider the outcome of policy making to be more costly than it was. And you can do calculations on the co-benefits of more bicycle lanes, and the co-benefits are often larger than the investment costs for those. And when I talked with one municipality in Sweden about it, they said, yeah, but the benefits are, well, those are for the region, landstinget, because they have lower healthcare costs due to people taking bike more often. That didn't prevent them from proposing more bicycle lanes. But without visualizing that, if you just visualize and calculate the cost, you get this very biased setup before policy making. So I think that is important. How to bring citizens on board? Well, civil society is doing the big part of the job. But I think there's potential for political decision makers, for politicians to also raise opinions here and to try to set the agenda. And that can be done in Sweden in much better ways than speaking about nuclear power, which has nothing to do with climate change in Sweden. But that's the framing in television debates often. I understand from Isak that we're supposed to break at 5 past, but the next full room session starts at 20 past. So those of you who want to stay until 18 minutes, another 10 minutes, of course you can do so. And I will stay here as well. Isak, do you want to comment, or your microphone is still?
No, it's unmuted and my sound is working. It's functioning again. Sorry about that. Yes, so for those of you who want to have a leg stretch, grab a cup of coffee or tea or a glass of water, go ahead and do that. This breakout session is officially over, but then you're welcome to stay if you want to speak more with Mikael or with each other around these questions as well. So I guess, Mikael, if you're kind enough to stay over the break.
Absolutely.
Okay. Otherwise, I'll see you back in the main session at 15:15.
I'm looking at the questions in the chat here, and I see if Folke, if you want to, Folke or Karina, if you want to state your questions orally.
Okay,
Folke, perhaps.
Thank you. I wrote the question to you also in the chat. I have joined the Swedish part of the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is called Klimatsvaret, where we are working for a carbon-free and dividend system here in Sweden. And we have met with a lot of parliamentarians from most parties, but it hasn't been very effective. And therefore I was interested in your research. If you think the committee level, for instance, Miljömålsberedningen, is a better part to reach for discussions about that.
Well, difficult to say. I mean, the politicians from all parties in the parliament participating in this all-party committee in Miljömålsberedningen, they are of course more knowledgeable and more aware about these issues and challenges than the average parliamentarian. Now they focus on, among other things, on consumption-related emissions, and not so much on policies. But my understanding is that there is very little support for carbon fee and dividend system in Sweden, and I'm not convinced either that that would be the most effective policy, which is in a debate and discussion as such. I can just add what I see among Swedish climate policy researchers. I actually did a study where I compiled all the proposals from Fossil Free Sweden, and I was asked to try to complement that with the missing policies, which industry associations had not presented themselves. It was a big subsidy investment request in these 22 roadmaps. A lot of good ideas, though. Not one word was mentioned about nuclear power, interestingly, in 356 proposals. But when I contacted a lot of other researchers and asked them about what do they see is missing in the policy mix, policy tool, the idea of limitations came up strongly compared to what I would have expected 10 years ago, when the pricing instrument was the strongest one. So rather limit, set deadlines, phase out the use of fossil fuels or technologies dependent on fossil fuels, rather than to tax it. To some extent, this is based on insights. Let's say when we phased out light bulbs, that would have been very difficult to do with pricing, because the price would have been so high, so politicians would have perhaps not dared to impose them. But instead, you could just ban it, which was done with the CFCs as well, because they were considered to cause harm that could never be valued in monetary terms. So this idea of limitations and so on is coming strongly, and that's absent from these roadmaps, but something that politicians now discuss. And we saw in the party leader debate just a week back or something, even the Prime Minister said that we should ban fossil fuel driven cars by 2030. That is very near in the future compared to previous policies, not necessarily compared to where we need to go in order to cope with the Paris Agreement, but there is a strong evolution of policies, and that's rapidly ongoing, and I think that should be welcomed. But if you want to contact people in the parliament who know a lot about climate change and try to influence them, I would say the members in Miljömålsberedningen are those to try to write to, and as an organization, ask to meet them. In particular, it's often easier to meet politicians when they go back home to the counties where they are elected.